Welcome to another episode of our Living with Jesus series. I am Brittany Shawley, and today I am here with the founder of the Circle of Atonement edition of A Course in Miracles, Robert Perry. Thank you for being with us today, Robert.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yes, I am really looking forward to your story. I don't know much at all, but we'll just kind of start at the top, share as much or as little as you're inspired to do, and we'll just see where this conversation leads us. But I'm really looking forward to this.
Right.
So the first question that I have for you is just a general question, but it is just talk to me about your relationship with Jesus. Like, how do you see him and who is he to you?
That's a big question. Well, my life is so much about him that it's kind of hard to condense it down, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I've come to see him as well as what A Course in Miracles says, as the leader in the plan of salvation. And what that means to me is that how do I put it? I do feel that the world has produced many evolved spiritual beings, and probably a few perfectly awakened beings, although I think that's probably very few. But I feel that he has something unique to offer. I think he has a perspective on the salvation process that is his and not everyone's. And so I feel that even though there is a universal truth, I think that he has his own unique slant on that. And it's something our world desperately needs. And so I see him as a truly singular figure in the world's spiritual evolution. And I feel that I've been following him for a very long time. I don't know that. I don't know how I could know that. But I feel like I've been in his camp for a long, long time, and that's just being kind of repeated in this lifetime.
Yes, I would love to know a little bit more about that story. But first, a question is coming, and you said like you feel like Jesus is a little bit different in his message for salvation than other maybe awakened beings. And what would you say makes him different? Like, what would you say is that special message that he has and has come with?
Good question. And when I think of that question, and my life has been so much trying to figure out the answer to that question and getting in touch with the answer. But I think of that both in terms of A Course in Miracles, which I personally believe he authored. And I think of that in terms of his appearance, of course, 2,000 years ago, and the teachings in the Gospels. And so I'm always kind of looking back and forth from one of those to the other. And what I feel I see in both is that his message for our own salvation and for the world's salvation is so centered on what you might call an egoless relationship with other people, in which we don't respond to people based upon our personal position relative to them, like who are they to us? How have they treated us? Right? How close or far are they from us? Have they mistreated us? He has advocated, now in A Course in Miracles and then in the Gospels, for kind of an unconditional relationship with others, where everyone is literally in our inner circle. Everyone has our complete love and our complete forgiveness. And then the other thing I think that is central to his own message is a picture of a loving God. And I know everyone thinks God's loving, but I think that I've never seen anything like his message about God. Um, where normally, like traditionally, we're taught that God is loving and he'll smite you. He's loving and he can send you to hell. And people will say that's part of his love too. Most of us don't buy that. Um, and then in the contemporary world, we're almost fixated on, well, God's got to be beyond the personal,
Mm.
right? God has to be more like suchness, oneness, emptiness, uh, isness, some kind of impersonal principle or essence. And I think it feels in contemporary spirituality, it feels like obviously the higher way to think that, well, a personal loving God is great, okay? But that's like on the level of duality.
Mm.
And we need to get beyond that to the true thing where God is beyond any sense of the personal. And I think Jesus stands for a personal God, yet who is so completely egoless that he loves, like I was talking about. He does not divide into good guys and bad guys, into those who are close to him and those who are far from him. Um, he considers everybody in his inner circle, no matter what, even the worst of us. And I think that's what he stands for to our world. And that is not a message that I see anywhere. And I feel like both, just to add on one more thing, I feel like in both the Course in Miracles and in the Gospels, he's saying that we can enter into this place where we live under the unconditional love and care of God. And we live in the unconditional love and care for others. And in that place, we can be carefree.
Yes.
We can live in a different world where it's like we are in the lap of luxury. We are fearless. We are, as I said, carefree, no matter what the world is dishing out to us. And I wish I saw that message more, but I tend to see it fully in A Course in Miracles and in those places in the Gospels that I think come from him. I think the Gospels are a complete mixed bag. And a lot that's in the Gospels goes directly against what I see as the teachings in the Gospels that are authentic to him. And that's a whole story. But I see the message I've just been talking about in those two places, and I wish I saw it in more places.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And I feel like what you've mentioned here is completely tying in where the Jesus is in the Gospels and in the Course in Miracles. And I'm feeling like you're saying it's God's laws, like love your neighbor as yourself, like love your enemy. Like Jesus didn't just hang out with his disciples. He hung out with like the tax collectors and like hung out with Matthew and all the quote unquote sinners.
Right.
Like to him, his love didn't stop. There were no conditions. And I think when it comes to something like Jesus and Jesus's message, we have to ask ourselves, when he says that it's an unconditional love of God, is that wholly true? Or does that mean it's an unconditional love with conditions? Because it can't be and both. And so I feel like we're at this place where we have to decide, like, what is Jesus's true message? What was his true message 2,000 years ago? And what is his true message today? And I feel like with the Course in Miracles, I have found that same message that you're talking about, that he's almost like other first, and it's like so selfless, but like it's the other first as the same as him. So it's not like he's leaving himself out. It's like, it's the law, as you give, you receive, right? And I feel like that is truly what he demonstrated then and what he demonstrates fully throughout the Course in Miracles. But what I really appreciate about your perspective on this is that we've almost now have Jesus, if we see him in this light of pointing to the unconditional love of God, and thus us being loved unconditionally and being included in his circle of love and care, all of us, no matter what we've done or anything like that, it allows us to almost feel like he's more, at least to me, like reachable, like here, like close, like he wants to welcome us as we are. And I feel like that's what I've found that he does in the course, that it's like, I take you as you are. Hey, let's clear up some things. Let's purify some junk that's getting in the way of me. But I'm here fully open arms for you, unconditionally loving you, so that you can go and unconditionally love your brothers as I have. Like, okay, if you say so, let me try it on. And it seems to work when we try it on. So it's just keep on keeping on.
I think in terms of finding out what he taught 2,000 years ago, it's very difficult. A lot of my history with Jesus has been reading the scholarship around the historical Jesus and what we can know about him and about what he taught. And it's not easy. And the problem is that, in my view, his followers were saturated in a certain worldview.
Yeah.
And that worldview was that God's judgment was coming.
Right.
And that culture was just soaked with that idea. So that God was calling his children of Israel, he was calling them to him. They were, wandering off and not following him. And he was sending them prophets and teachers, and they were killing them. And he has sent Jesus, and they killed him too. And now there's going to be a judgment coming. And I think that view, his followers, including John the Baptist, including Paul, they had soaked that up. And so his message, in my view, was incompatible with that, because the teachings that we can have most confidence go back to him are full, both the sayings and the parables and also the demonstration in his life. In addition to his teachings, he kept showing us in different ways, there's this group and this group, and you would think that because the one group is the people, the obedient ones, you'd think they'd be favored. But in fact, God does not distinguish between them. And you see that in parable after parable. You see that in different sayings. You see that in how he lived his life. And the idea that there's the two groups, the good guy, the obedient ones and the disobedient ones, and God does not distinguish between them, that's incompatible with the other view I was talking about, where Israel has gone astray in spite of a few obedient ones, and God's going to look at those two groups and smite the ones who've gone astray and bring his judgment down on them. Those are completely incompatible views. And I think that we've got to decide which one really traces back to Jesus, because they don't go together.
Right.
And unfortunately, the dominant note in contemporary scholarship going back over a century has been that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. He was preaching about God's coming judgment. And there's no full consensus in historical Jesus scholarship, because the field has not come together on a single view. There's a lot of different views, but the dominant note, from as far as I can tell, has been and continues to be that he was an apocalyptic preacher, preaching about God does separate the good guys from the bad guys. And there's so many bad guys, his judgment's going to come down on our generation. And I think what happened is that view leaked into the tradition through his followers, because it was everywhere in that culture, and it got put on his lips in the Gospels. And it's unfortunate, because I would love to see Jesus scholarship, embrace what I think is the real view, rather than coalescing to some degree around the idea of him teaching of a God who's bringing his coming judgment.
Right. Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm having another question kind of spawn on this, because to me, this is where Jesus coming back with A Course in Miracles is so divinely, incredibly helpful, because he is giving us a tool for mind training, right? Where we can learn to discern between the thoughts that are conditioned and passed on to us by the collective, and then the thoughts of the Holy Spirit, right? That Jesus even said when he was here 2,000 years ago, that he's left us with the Holy Spirit, that we can commune and listen to and follow the voice of the Holy Spirit. So contained within A Course in Miracles, it also does talk about the Last Judgment, right? But it also, I feel, reinterprets it a little bit for us and allows us to kind of see what Jesus perhaps did mean about this idea of the final judgment or the last judgment. What are your thoughts or takeaways from Jesus's explanation of the last judgment through an A Course in Miracles lens?
Yeah, well, first of all, I should say that I strongly doubt that the historical Jesus taught about the Last Judgment. I think that's something that came into Judaism through its contact with a very old but still existing religion called Zoroastrianism. Have you heard of them?
No.
So there's still about 10 million of them or so around.
Oh, wow.
But they predated Judaism.
Okay.
And in Zoroastrianism, there was this cosmic battle between good and evil. And I think Judaism inherited the Last Judgment concept through them.
Okay.
Especially because when they had the exile in Babylon, they were exposed to that. I think if you look at the teachings that we can be more confident come from the historical Jesus, they're about wisdom for living today.
Right.
They're not about some of these larger questions. So I think that's another thing that leaked into the tradition from outside of his own teachings. But you're right. In A Course in Miracles, of course, he takes the Last Judgment concept and reinterprets it. And he says different things about it over the course of the entire course. It first pops up in chapter 2 in the text, and then it reappears in different forms elsewhere a number of times. But as best as I can understand it, he's offering a radically different view of the Last Judgment.
Yeah.
So, of course, traditionally in the Last Judgment, God does the very thing I was saying he did not do in the original teachings of Jesus. He separates out, right, the obedient from the disobedient, and then the latter are cast into the lake of fire.
Right.
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 And the former get to live in God's presence forever and ever and ever, which is a very frightening idea.
It's terrifying. People are terrified of this idea. Yes. I have people coming to me all the time, like traumatized by this idea. So yes, It's a big idea.
And so in the Course, he's very aware of just how traumatizing that idea has been for humanity for centuries. And his idea is that rather than God looking at different souls and separating the worthy from the unworthy, we do what looks like some massive life review, and we review all of our words and deeds and thoughts throughout our entire journey through time, which has got to be an unimaginable stretch of time. We review the whole thing, and we decide which of our thoughts and deeds were in line with reality and which ones weren't. And we completely let go and kind of, flush or cleanse from our unconscious even all of those ones that were unloving and therefore out of alignment with reality. And then through that process, we come to our own final judgment about everything. And our own final judgment basically is that only ultimate reality is real. Only God and his creation and heaven is real. And everything else, including our separation from God, including the world of time and space, is totally unreal. And that's, in some places, what the Course talks about as our own final judgment. We go through this review process and reach that judgment where we say, okay, only this is real and everything else is not.
Yes.
And that allows us to then return to our heavenly awakened state.
Yes, exactly. And I feel like that perspective is showing that like God is still an unconditionally loving God because he sees us as souls who are all worthy, but it's us as souls who have forgotten how God sees us. So us as souls have a choice to review the thoughts that we thought and thus the actions that came from those thoughts and deem those as being, like you're saying, real or unreal, like loving or not loving. And only that which is loving and real and eternal stands. And that's a choice of souls. souls. So in a sense, it's almost putting the final judgment as being like God's already judged our nature as souls as being loved and whole as he created
Right.
it. And it's just us that need to have that return over in our perception to be like, what am I really, and what is real really? So I feel like that's what Jesus does, allows us to have these conversations to really discern and contemplate and question and be curious and pray about, because these are important questions that I feel we can ask
before
now.
we move on, Brittany,
Please, yeah.
One last thing about the Course's view of the Last Judgment.
Yeah.
It seems very kind of mirrored or reflected in what people experience as the life review and near-death experiences.
Right, that's what I was seeing too when you said that.
Yeah, what people come back again and again and say is, I reviewed my whole life to see, basically what was good and useful and what was not so good. And it wasn't anyone judging me.
Right.
It wasn't God judging me. I was judging which thoughts were the worthwhile ones, that were the thoughts and the deeds of love.
Yeah.
And which ones were the ones that, represented mistakes and so on. And I think that what the Course is saying about the Last Judgment is a really eerie mirror of that, only it's seeing a life review that takes place on a much vaster scale.
Correct. Yes. That's really important, and something for all of us to kind of contemplate and open our hearts to, our all-loving God. Okay, so this kind of transitions a little bit to kind of understand more about how you came to this understanding of Jesus and love of God and all the things that we're talking about. So my question is basically like, how did you come to accept him in your life, or did you always? But was there kind of like a before and after where you kind of really changed how you saw Jesus and your relationship to him? Maybe more of a little bit of your story background there.
Yeah, well, it was very, very, very gradual for me. So I'll give you the story. I grew up in church, first Presbyterian, then we became Lutheran, and my youth group in my teens, we were kind of all born again, and I went with that, and two things happened in me from that. One was I had a sense that there was something supremely important about Jesus. And at that point in my life, I wanted to be an artist. And I thought, I want to, like, through my career, reach a point where I make the ideal, I paint or draw the ideal portrait of Jesus. So I had a sense that he was supremely important. At the same time, I was doing a lot of thinking and a lot of reflecting on how the mind works and what is real and what's not real. And I realized that I didn't know why I believed in Christianity and the Bible. And so I kind of left. Because I went on my own search for God. And what happened was, this takes me into my first year in college. I did a ton of reading, primarily in my college library at the time, in which I realized that as you read in different religions and in the mystical traditions, and there were all kinds of things like mediumship and people's memories of past lives, and I got into near-death experiences. Raymond Moody's book had just come out a few years before this, which I read and was electrified by. What I realized was that there was kind of a universal truth out there. It was very general and had a lot of different permutations and different versions, but when people touch something beyond the physical, they seem to see a similar landscape where everything's one, where our own true identity is part of that oneness, where we're on a journey here to wake up fully and reunite with that. And so I got into that, but I still carried my Jesus thing. And so I gravitated towards those kind of versions of the universal truth that had a Jesus focus. So I got into the Edgar Cayce readings very heavily. And I also got into the Shroud of Turin. This was back in like the late 70s when there was an a scientific examination of the shroud
Mm.
where a bunch of scientists examined it in person for a number of days. Um, and then what happened with me is I got into the whole spiritual thing, retaining the Jesus focus. And then after a few years, I got into A Course in Miracles. And so that was a little over 40 years ago now. And I've had, basically, I'm not the kind of person who like gets it all at once. I'm a plotter. I get a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and the process just keeps going. So at any given time, I look back and think, I was so clueless. But my process is just a sort of a gradual incremental one.
Sure.
So I've been on a long process with trying to understand A Course in Miracles and trying to understand Jesus in the Course. I've been on a long process, some years after all that stuff, like when I was going into college and getting into the course, I got heavily into the historical Jesus scholarship. So I've been on a long process of trying to understand what was he really about? What happened back then? You know, what did he really teach? Did he really do miracles? Did he actually rise from the dead? Did he literally do that? And so what I've been doing is kind of ping-ponging back and forth for all these years, like getting into the course, getting into the historical Jesus, looking back and forth between them. And then through that process, I've also come to believe that what he's doing with the world is absolutely not over.
Right.
I believe he's behind the scenes pulling all kinds of threads. I think that hopefully the historical scholarship around Jesus is going to get to a point where I think it's more reflective of him.
Yeah.
I'm not a credentialed scholar. I'm not a scholar, but I do feel that maybe with the help of the course, I've had some insights into the historical Jesus, and I'd love to see the field as a whole get in that same direction. I guess anybody would. And I believe that A Course in Miracles, even though it's a tiny thing in the world now, I do think it's his second coming in a sense, in book form, not
Book
in
form.
physical form,
Right.
you know. And I think that there's plans for that.
Yes.
I think that as small as it is now, I think it's meant to grow into something huge.
Yes.
And so, you know, there's both my evolving understanding of him and my sense that he's trying to do something in the world.
Yeah.
And I have a conviction going way back that I've been called to be part of that process. I think many people
Me
have.
too.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot.
Yeah.
And so that's another dimension of my process with him, feeling like that he's here, he's hired me, which was a huge thing for me to fully accept
Mm.
originally, you know,
Mm.
overwhelming thing.
Mm.
And that it's my job to be a student of his, it's my job to be one of his workers, and to be an instrument of his in the world.
Oh, amen, Robert. I just want to highlight that because I agree. Like we're being asked to be his students first and foremost. And I feel like that whether we are using the Bible as a tool or A Course in Miracles as a tool, he's still our teacher and we are the student. But then second of all, you said that we are also here to be his worker. Like that's what I feel too, that I feel like Jesus is my boss. I say it all the time. Like my only boss is God and Jesus, but I'm so excited to get up every day and like work for this mission. Right. And then the third one is to be the instrument, right? The instrument of peace, the instrument of love, the instrument of miracles, and to really extend that into the world in whatever way is being asked of us with our little part to play. But I feel like when we put all of our parts, like I see them as like puzzle pieces together, like it creates that whole. And I feel like one of the main messages, from my opinion, I didn't grow up Christian or study the Bible like you have, but I am reading it and I'm reading it with Christ and I'm letting myself be taught. And so I feel like what I'm really seeing is that his message was always like, the kingdom has come. Like heaven is here now. Like let's do this and celebrate, please. Like I need you. Let's do this, right? And so I feel
Yeah.
like a very similar kind of sentiment with the A Course in Miracles, that it's like, okay, I feel like we're in the process of birthing this kingdom, this heaven, this shared reality, the shared purpose that he's speaking of. And but it's our duty to, in a sense, be like, say, okay, yes, like I'm in. I don't know what this means. I don't know what this looks like. Heck, I'm scared, like, but I'm just saying yes. And I feel like when we say yes, then that's when we get to see the fruits of that decision, and the fruits bring that calm and that peace and that understanding and that conviction and that everything that we're seeking. But I've really found that it starts with the decision and anchoring on to, like, I guess, like, prove to me that this love is real. This is what you're talking about. And then through us, it becomes recognizable and manifest. So I guess that's my way of saying thank you. Amen. I join you in this and with him in this. And it's a big task.
Yeah, and I think we're still trying to hike ourselves up to understanding what he's about. And then the
Yeah,
next step, of course, is actually embodying
right.
what he's about. And I think he stood for something and stands for something so unconventional that we're still like groping after it. Well, hopefully we're groping after it. I think mostly we're just misusing it, misunderstanding it,
Right.
you
Agreed.
know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that happened with Christianity. I think it's absolutely happened with the Course in Miracles.
Yeah.
And I think the ideal thing is we don't yet really get him, but we're getting closer and closer. And we don't yet embody him, but we're trying. And we're trying to shed that in us, which does not reflect that.
Yes. Completely agree with you. Yes. Ah, okay. So my next question on this, actually, it kind of ties in with this idea of like shedding the old, like shedding what wasn't his message back then, what isn't his message in A Course in Miracles, and really coming directly to him, to the best of our ability each day. Like it's like the purifying with the books, but also purifying, our minds, our hearts, our actions. But this kind of ties in a little bit practically. But do you include, obviously you do, but like how do you include Jesus in your everyday life and work? Like what does that look like for you? Are you pray, meditate, or do the lessons? Like what does that kind of look like for you?
Well, I think there's sort of the direct inclusion and the indirect inclusion.
Yeah.
The direct inclusion is, I like your language of boss. I think exactly the same way. Like,
Awesome.
even though, I do think our hearing is imperfect. If you sit down and get guidance to other people, not everyone's going to get the same thing.
Right.
Sometimes it happens. Mostly it doesn't. There's a lot of fog in between our mind and
Sure.
his. But still, I feel like he's my boss, and I do what I can to tune in to, my boss's directives.
Yeah.
So I ask for a lot of guidance throughout the day, and I always ask Jesus for guidance. It doesn't quite work for me if I ask the Holy Spirit. It doesn't quite work for me if I ask God. I think it's legitimate, and A Course in Miracles has us ask the Holy Spirit for guidance, has us ask God for guidance. But for me, I ask Jesus. And it's just how I think of the guidance process. And I just talk to him about my, what's going on with me, my work with the course and with my lesson for the day, and my work in terms of my function with the circle, in terms of teaching and so on. Emily and I are constantly brainstorming, how to move forward, how to break through more fully. And, that process is very anchored in turning to him. Another thing that is very important for me, which is a whole topic in itself that I don't really want to, or we don't have time to get into, it's not even all that germane, is I very much feel that he speaks to me and to us through striking coincidences, synchronicities.
Mm-hmm.
And I have developed over the last 45 years a very specific system for reading a certain specific kind of synchronicity, that I feel speaks with its own voice, that's not just my projecting onto it. And so a lot of what I feel is guidance from him that I frankly put more faith in than my own hearing, because my hearing is, pretty so-so, um, is these striking coincidences that fit a certain model I've built up over many years. I published about it. I've published in a psychiatric journal about it. That speak with each of these things speaks with their own voice. It's not me just saying, "Hey, I saw a butterfly, and it means this," and so that's a big part of it. And then so much of my engagement with him day to day is the indirect, where I'm trying to follow his teachings.
Yeah.
I'm a huge believer in the central importance of the workbook practice. I feel like for some reason that hasn't really taken hold in the Course in Miracles community. I think we've all collectively agreed, we can kind of ignore that pretty much. We can love the work. We can love the workbook. We love it. And we'll read it in the morning. But we all know that if we're spiritually savvy, we can kind of not think we should follow those instructions all day.
Right.
And my belief is, he says, if we're going to get to the goal, the way is through doing the exercises. He says it flat out. He acts that way all through the workbook. He never gives us the outs that we've given ourselves, right? Where we tell ourselves, well, I just need to kind of get it and forgive myself for not doing it right, and then I'm there. He says doing the mind training, doing the practice is the way. And so I'm a huge believer. It's been my main focus with the Course. I think people assume I'm all into the text, which I am, but I've mainly been into the workbook. So I consider that. You too?
Me too. That's how it started for me.
Yeah, that's how I started too.
Yeah.
So I consider that me working with I'm following his teachings throughout the day by doing that. And as I do it, I'm kind of talking to him as well. But I consider doing the practice an indirect engagement with him, because I'm following him.
Right. Yep. Yes. Oh my God, I experienced it the same as you, which is always so incredible and confirming, right? Because I did the same. When I ask for guidance, I ask Jesus, because I don't know. He's my brother. He's holding my hand. He's here. I don't know. He'll tell me what to do. To me, the Holy Spirit is like my thought adjuster. So the Holy Spirit is the corrector of my perception when I'm making mistakes and making shit up. But then to me, God is just the container that holds all of it in love. So I go to Jesus too. But then it is the practical workbook side of things. What does he say at the beginning too? That this is not a course in theology. This is it's not a course in theology, it's a course in experience, and it's not only possible, it's necessary, or something like that. I butchered that totally. But the idea that experience is what he's after here. He doesn't care that we understand it or like it or don't like it or fight it or resist it. He says, just do it. And if you do it, you will be brought to the experience that it's pointing toward. And to me, it's proved accurate, in my life.
Yeah, I would say something maybe a little bit different.
Sure.
In that I think that there are places in the Course where he talks about the theoretical, like in the manual and the clarification of terms, and you were talking about clarification of terms.
Right.
Where he talks about the theoretical in a somewhat dismissive way. But he also uses the term theoretical in a fully positive way in the workbook. And the idea there is that we need the theory the text provides if the workbook exercises are going to be really meaningful.
Sure, it's the foundation.
It's the foundation. And so what we're doing in the workbook practice is we're practicing ideas. Right? Every lesson has the idea for the day, and the lesson's instructions are the practice of that idea. And practicing an idea requires a certain understanding of it.
True.
And the more understanding you have, the more powerful and meaningful that practice is. And so I've come to a view in which we need the text because the text gives us the ideas. And we need the workbook because the workbook is the use of the ideas. Mm-hmm. The ideas aren't any good unless you use them, but you can't use them without first having them.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a really super positive place for the text, for the workbook, and they have an intimate relationship. But what we've done on the workbook side is kind of say, we don't have to do it.
I know.
you know?
Yeah.
And it's really unfortunate. And we've been given an out by some of our most influential teachers to not do it.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like I want to tie in there just because the course is the text, the workbook, and the teacher's manual, that I found like the teacher's manual is Jesus already at the beginning before you even started saying like, hey, this is where we're going, right? That I'm asking you to be a teacher of God, right? That you are going to pass this course. I'm already assuming that you're going to, if you do it properly, if you do the lessons and read the workbook and, or excuse me, read
Right.
the text, you know,
Right.
if you do it properly, take him as your teacher, resign as your own teacher. But then like the manual for teachers is also extremely, you know, practical in the sense that it answers all those like lingering questions that, you know, we might have. And he even talks about reincarnation in there, and he talks about how is healing accomplished, and he talks about the last judgment, he talks about all these things in there. And so I feel like that's also just a testament to Jesus's whole mind, that he gave us this whole system, that it's not just like learning the course, which it is in the text, and it's not just applying the course, which it is in the workbook, but it's also extending what you've learned by the end of it through the teacher's manual, right? So it's like, it's again just a testament to like his whole mind and how perfect this tool is for us
Yeah.
when we use it the way that it's given us to be used.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely singing my song there. I've been trying to say for decades that the teacher's manual is an actual manual for teachers.
Yes.
And I mean, it's even characterized in the preface to the FIP edition that it's just a Q&A. Just a Q&A for, you know, answering questions that students may ask. But it talks about itself as a teacher's manual. It talks about the journey that the teacher goes on. And in that journey, it's answering questions, most of which I would say are relevant to the teacher's journey. And it outlines two roles that the teacher of God in the course setting may take. And no one talks about these. One role is that he's talking about teachers taking on individual pupils in the course, so that people who have gone through the text in the workbook have reached some level of, you know, advancement, maybe not that great, but still something. They take on individual pupils in A Course in Miracles that they mentor in the course. And that idea is almost anathema out there, but it's in there in black and white. It's black and white. It's right there. And the other role, which comes a little bit later in the manual, starting with section 5, is he talks about course teachers of God being healers who go to sick people and give them healing,
Yeah.
like Christian Science practitioners, you know. And neither of those roles, not only have they not taken root, but they have not been acknowledged as an okay thing.
Right.
So we're still talking about self-study course to self-study course. And in the manual, he's talking about new students being pupils of a personal teacher who guides them, who helps them ask for guidance about what volume to start with, who helps them navigate the territory, like, is reincarnation part of this or not? Who just guides them through along the path. And we're still talking about self-study. Everyone says self-study.
I know. And I think what's curious about this is like, because I came to the course from Jesus. I've never, but I had my partner, Tom, who had been doing this for 7 years before I had. So in a sense, for a while, he was a teacher and I was a pupil. And then it was like, my teacher is Jesus and then I'm the pupil. And then now I'm the teacher to others and they're my pupils. But I found that there's so many core tenets of the course, whereas he says, as you teach, you learn, right? Like as you give, you receive. Like atonement is a lesson in sharing. Like what better way to learn these things than in a relationship between fellow course students? And I've always said, for me, I feel like I've learned the most when I let myself be used and I'm answering the questions that my brothers come. And then I go, oh, wow, that was genius. And I know it's not of me, but it's in me and it's through me and it helps us both, you know? And so I feel like that is where it becomes out of this just self-study intellect and it becomes this shared experience, shared purpose, that really gets to be in the experiential realm of things. Is that when we take it from the head, just for me alone, and it's something that we share in as souls, as God's children. And that's, to me, where the real power has happened, is in that giving and receiving or teaching and learning exchange. So
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. You know, few things about that. I mean,
Hmm.
obviously everything you say, I could say a ton of things about. Everything I
I
say,
know, I
same
know.
thing.
I
Um,
know.
but what I would say is that we have almost stripped the interpersonal out of the course over as the years have gone on.
Yeah,
It's so interpersonal.
it is.
As we often point out at the Circle, the main meaning of miracles in the course is they are expressions of love. One person
Yes,
expressing love to another.
exactly.
Um, and one thing I would say is I think the course is super into the head. I really do.
Right.
We need the head, okay? We need the theory, we need the study, but what we don't need to do is stop there.
Exactly. Let it fall.
Because all that stuff, yeah, all that stuff is meant to get applied and used in our internal practice
Yep.
and in our interactions.
Yep.
Because there's one place where the Course says that it, it amounts to this. This is from I Need Do Nothing in the text, that the special means the Course is using to save us time is shared holy instance between us and somebody else, where together we have a holy instant,
Yeah.
which the Course called in other places a holy encounter,
Right.
right? So we could say a holy encounter is the special means this Course is using to save us time. That's an encounter. That's
Yeah.
interpersonal. That's a
Yeah.
moment of joining. We've lost that
Hmm.
from there.
Okay.
I think, there's been some editing, of course, that can obscure that a bit. I was unhappy back in '92 when they came out with the second edition, and all of the holy relationship language that was you plural, like
Hmm.
the both of you, was changed to you and your brother. And some of those changes, in my view, most of them, in my view, didn't change the meaning, but a lot of them changed the meaning. And
Right.
they made the holy relationship sound like a solitary thing.
Right.
Um, and that being said, I got the weeness of it, if that's a word,
The weenus.
from the FIP edition. I think a stronger influence has just been what people have been taught.
Okay.
Because in
Yeah.
my experience, what you're taught influences you more than what you read.
Right.
And so you can read something on the page, and if you were taught something different, your mind just edits, and
Mm.
just snips it out, or reinterprets it, because the human teachers end up being a more powerful influence. So if they are saying there's no one out there, there's just you
Right.
here, you're going to read something different in the course on every page, and your mind will just edit it out or
Right.
reinterpret it.
Right. Yes. No, that makes total sense. And for the record, Tom too only studied from FIP, and it's all interpersonal for him. So I completely agree with you. But I also think what you're saying is kind of in a sense what's also happened with the Bible, that based on what they were taught about it, they seem to like me and a Christian can sit in front of each other. I read the paragraph, he reads the paragraph, and I get something totally different out of it than he does. But a lot of the time I've noticed, like our previous conversation, it's because he has this idea of being judged at the end and like going to hell or going to heaven based on what you did and all this stuff.
Right,
And so
right.
because of that clouding of the meaning, we really do perceive it completely different. And this is back to the power of the workbook of clearing the fog to the best of our ability each day as we go along this journey. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
There's so much to be said about that, but but
I
go
know.
ahead.
I know. We can go forever. Okay. Maybe I want to ask this question. We may have already touched upon it a bit, but we'll see where it goes. But like, how do you view Jesus's role as teacher of humanity? Do you see him as a teacher of humanity? Like, how do you see
Hmm.
that? Yeah, I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, well, I do think that he is literally the lead teacher.
Yeah.
I think that's because he has a grasp that nobody else has. Um, the Course says it's because he was the first to complete his own special function perfectly.
Right.
So it doesn't say it's because he woke up first. It never even says he woke up first. It says that in terms of his function of serving his brothers, he was the first to do that perfectly.
Mm.
Um, and so I do think that there is something, I think he's working through every tradition. I think he's working in every life. I think he's just as active in the lives of atheists or Satan worshipers or whatever, as any of us. However, I think in his activity, he knows how priceless that unique perspective of his is.
Mm.
And I think it has changed humanity. I think it's going to change humanity even more. I think it's gotten through to some degree, more than we might think. Um, Emily and I have been really hot recently on the fact that New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman is writing a book about how Jesus, his life and teachings transformed civilization more than any other single thing has transformed civilization in history. And that at the heart of that transformation was the value of love.
Mm-hmm.
And that ancient philosophies were not other oriented. They were very much into virtue, into character. Like if you know Stoicism, they're all into virtue and into the rightness of character, but they were not thinking that the things you did out of your right character and out of your virtue were other oriented. You did
Right.
them for the sake of the rightness of your own character,
Yeah.
not for the sake of the other person. And Jesus introduced, according to Bart Ehrman, something that changed the world, which was this love ethic, which was other oriented.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've been really into for some years now is that so much of the nonviolence movement, which has, starting with Gandhi, transformed the world,
Mm-hmm.
set free countries, had a huge impact through Martin Luther King in the United States. That, interestingly, a lot of that traces back to the Sermon on the Mount.
Mm.
There's an interesting sequence that's not well known, but it's very established. And that is that in the late 1800s, like 1880s, Leo Tolstoy, the famous author, had a spiritual kind of awakening, became a hugely influential spiritual teacher.
Mm.
And he rooted everything in the teachings of Jesus, especially the Sermon on the Mount.
Mm.
And the Sermon on the Mount contains, like, the greatest concentration, in my view, his authentic teachings. It contains other stuff too. But I think that the stuff that we can trace most reliably back to him, so much of that's found in the Sermon on the Mount. The radical, love your enemy kind of stuff. And Tolstoy was a massively influential teacher, and that part of his life has been largely forgotten. But he then influenced and had direct correspondence with Gandhi.
Mm.
And a lot of what was the foundation for Gandhi of his nonviolence. A lot of it was also in Hinduism too.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
But a lot of it was the Sermon on the Mount as mediated by Tolstoy.
Mm.
And then through Gandhi, that whole thing flowed into Martin Luther King and also some other people like Catholics like Dorothy Day and so on. And they changed life in the US.
Right.
Whereas Gandhi's nonviolence changed countries around the world. And what's interesting is I think that was, so much of that was Jesus at work. People were hearkening back to love your enemies, don't resist the evildoer, turn the other cheek, and so on. And I think that his influence, sorry, I get emotional. It has been changing our world. It has been working. I've been lamenting it for years, it not working.
Mm.
But I think it has been working. And I think it's going to do incalculably more as we go forward. We need that perspective. And I think he's still here. He's still giving it to us.
Yes. Oh, I think that's so important for all of us to remember that it has worked, it's been working, and it will continue to work. Like if that loving way was able to bring forward the civil rights movement, for example, we can do the same thing in present day for what we want to see in our future. But I think what I've really kind of gained from this conversation is really seeing that Jesus isn't wanting to just be contained in our own psyche. He's wanting to be in our own psyche, but fall to our heart so we can extend it to our brothers and sisters in whatever way we are being asked to do. And that he needs us, and to see that he has been working all this way along to bring positive change, and he will continue to bring positive change now and into the future. And there's so much hope and gratitude really for that. And I do agree with you. He's just scratching the surface, the stuff like the course.
Yeah, I know we're wrapping up. I just want to add something onto that.
Sure.
I do think that with the Course in Miracles, we're just at the very, very beginning. We're at the equivalent of 80 AD in the first century. And he talked about it to Helen about it growing from infancy into a helper of the world.
Humanity, yeah.
And that's, I think, where it's going. And
Yeah.
he's still there. He's our
Yes.
boss. He's directing this thing. And there's been a lot of missteps already in the last 50 years. But I think we're at the beginning.
Yes.
And it's going to grow into a helper of the world.
Yes. We're at the beginning. We're also close enough to the beginning that like all those
Right.
mistakes can be corrected before they carry forward. Right. And
They
I'm a
can all
big
be
believer
corrected.
that. Yeah.
And there was a promise he gave to Helen that they would be.
And I trust that. Yes. Well, thank you for doing your part in this correction. Thank you for listening to him and following his voice and doing everything you've done and are doing. You really are a beacon of light in this community that I just really hope continues to shine so bright so that more people can be attracted to you and to the course and to Emily and all the amazing things that you guys are doing for him and for humanity. I love you guys, and I'm so grateful for everything you've done and are doing. Seriously.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. And it has been really nice to see that a lot of the perspectives that are so dear to my heart that you're carrying as well. That's reassuring. It's great to hear.
Good. Thank you. Yes. And I feel the same way. It's just like, there's my Jesus. It just adds to the faith and the beauty. And that's why I'm so grateful to do this series, because I get to have that little peek into the heart of how you live and work with him. And when you see it mirroring it back to you, it's everything. So thank you so much, Robert, for your time and sharing everything with us today.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
It has been. And thank you everyone for watching. See you soon. Bye.